The afternoon sun stretched long golden beams across the pathways of the Chicago Zoo, catching on glass railings and wet stone where children's sneakers had splashed water from the penguin pool. Thomas Harrison guided his daughter with a steady hand, his other stuffed into the pocket of his tailored jacket. Crowds pressed in around them, families laughing, couples taking pictures. But for Thomas, the world had narrowed to the small fingers entwined with his own. Emma's grip was light but unyielding, a lifeline he would never let slip. 8 years old and blind since the accident that had stolen her mother, Emma moved through the world with a strange mixture of fragility and fearlessness. Where most children leaned on sight, she leaned on subtler cues, the tremor in a voice, the uneven rhythm of a step, the sigh a person released when they thought no one was listening. Thomas often thought she saw more than anyone around her. "Daddy?" Emma whispered, tilting her face toward the chorus of chattering birds and laughing children near the exhibit. "They sound happy. The penguins sound happy too." Her voice carried a kind of wonder that pierced him in ways he could never admit to the men who sat across boardroom tables from him. He swallowed the familiar ache, brushing his thumb against her knuckles. "They're waddling around," he said, softening his usually clipped tone, "sliding into the water. It's like they're putting on a show for you." Emma smiled faintly, leaning into his side, and for a heartbeat the world felt almost whole again. Almost. The spell shattered with a voice that rose above the chatter, sharp as glass. "I don't pay a fortune for my granddaughter to frequent the same spaces as people like you." Thomas turned his head toward the commotion, his gaze narrowing. Just beyond the curve of the penguin pool, a woman stood like an overdressed sentinel, her harem, ends heavy with jewelry that flashed in the sun. Her posture reeked of entitlement, the kind of superiority that came not from confidence but from generations of unearned power. At her side, a small blonde girl clutched a plush toy, wide-eyed and confused. Facing her was a young woman in a simple uniform. She held the child's hand gently, her expression calm in a way that almost seemed deliberate. Her skin gleamed with sweat under the afternoon heat, yet she did not flinch under the verbal assault. "You have your own places to go, don't you think?" the older woman continued, her words echoing off the stone walkway. Around them, people shifted uncomfortably, torn between intervening and pretending not to hear. Thomas felt Emma's small hand tighten against his. "Daddy," she whispered, her brows knitting together. "Why is that lady yelling at the pretty lady?" Thomas opened his mouth, but no words came. He had negotiated billion-dollar contracts, faced down rivals in corporate wars, but in that moment he was disarmed by his daughter's question, by her ability to name the injustice without needing to see it. "She's being unkind," he managed finally. Emma shook her head. "No, she's sad. The pretty lady is sad. I can feel it." Her voice held a certainty that made his chest constrict. He looked back at the young nanny. Despite the venom being spat in her direction, she stood with a serenity that was almost unsettling. There was no fluster, no nervous shifting, none of the defensiveness he might have expected. Instead, her eyes, dark, steady, seemed to take in every insult with the patience of someone cataloging evidence. Thomas frowned. This was not the response of a woman beaten down by life or used to silent submission. This was something else. She was not simply enduring humiliation, she was absorbing it, storing it away with the precision of a strategist. "Daddy?" Emma whispered again, tugging gently at his sleeve. "The pretty lady isn't afraid. She's waiting." The word startled him. Waiting for what? He studied the young woman more closely, catching the faintest curve of a smile at the corner of her lips. Not mocking, not weak, but deliberate, as though she knew something her accuser could never imagine. It unsettled him in ways he could not yet name. In that crowded zoo, with the laughter of children and the splashing of penguins as backdrop, Thomas Harrison felt the first stirrings of a story far larger than the day's outing. He did not yet know who the young nanny truly was, but one thing struck him with the clarity of instinct. She was not what she appeared to be, and whatever secret she carried, it would not stay hidden for long. The blonde child's shriek cut through the air like a warning bell. One second she was clutching the nanny's hand, the next she had wriggled free, bolting toward the shimmering water where penguins slid and dove in their glass enclosure. "Lily, no!" The young nanny's voice was urgent but not panicked. She surged forward, skirts brushing against her legs, her shoes slipping on damp stone. Thomas felt Emma tense beside him, her head jerking toward the sound of hurried footsteps. The girl tripped, arms flailing dangerously close to the low railing that separated spectators from the birds. For a frozen heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then the nanny lunged, scooping Lily against her chest just as the child's momentum carried them both onto the slick pavement. They landed hard. Gasps rippled through the gathered crowd. Lily clung to her rescuer, wide-eyed, while the young woman's uniform absorbed the damp grime of the walkway. "Are you hurt?" she murmured to the child, brushing a strand of blonde hair from her face with a tenderness that spoke of practiced care. Lily shook her head, her lips quivering, before burying her face in the nanny's shoulder. The grandmother's response was not gratitude. Her jeweled fingers clutched her hand, bag as though bracing against contamination. "Now look what you've done," she snapped, voice slicing through the murmurs. "You can't even keep a child upright without causing a spectacle. People like you should never be entrusted with our children." Silence followed, heavy and appalled. The young nanny rose slowly, balancing Lily on her hip. She was soaked, her neat uniform stained with mud and water, but her composure was intact. Her gaze swept the onlookers briefly, then settled on the older woman. "You're right," she said softly, adjusting the child in her arms. "People like me do have a specific place in society." It should have sounded submissive. Instead, her tone carried something else, something deliberate, layered with quiet defiance. The words hung in the air, neither apology nor concession, and for reasons Thomas could not explain, they unsettled him more than the insult that had prompted them. Beside him, Emma tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered urgently, "the pretty lady. She isn't sad anymore." "What do you mean?" Thomas murmured, unable to take his eyes from the nanny. "She's strong. I can hear it." Emma tilted her head, her sightless eyes searching the space where the voices had been. "Like she's carrying a secret in her pocket." Thomas's throat tightened. His daughter's words often bordered on eerie, her perceptions too sharp, too intuitive for her years. But now, staring at the woman across the penguin pool, Thomas knew Emma was right. The nanny did not look broken. She looked prepared. The faint smile that flickered across her lips as she handed Lily back to her grandmother was not the smile of a servant desperate to please. It was the smile of someone who knew this scene was only the prologue to something greater. As the crowd began to disperse, Thomas felt a knot twist low in his stomach. He had come to the zoo hoping to give his daughter a simple day of laughter and distraction, but what he had witnessed instead lodged itself in his mind with stubborn weight. Emma leaned against him, her small voice trembling with both innocence and certainty. "Daddy, the pretty lady isn't just a nanny. I can tell." Thomas exhaled slowly, eyes lingering on the woman as she disappeared into the throng with her charge and the grandmother still muttering by her side. He did not know her name, her story, or the secret she carried, but he knew this: the encounter was not over. Not by a long shot. The evening settled over the city like a velvet curtain, dimming the skyline into a tapestry of shadows and distant lights. Thomas Harrison sat in the driver's seat of his black SUV, parked along the curb outside a gated estate on the North Shore. He hadn't meant to follow them. That's what he told himself, though his knuckles on the steering wheel betrayed the truth. Something about the young nanny, about her unnerving calm, had refused to leave his mind. Emma had fallen asleep in the back seat, her head resting against her car seat, one hand curled around the worn, stuffed bear she never traveled without. Thomas glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her face was serene, but he knew from experience that serenity didn't mean peace. Even in sleep, she listened, absorbing currents of emotion around her like a tuning fork. He hated exposing her to cruelty, yet he also knew he couldn't shield her forever. He was about to start the engine when voices drifted through the cracked open window. "Do you have any idea how close that child came to disaster?" The grandmother's voice was unmistakable, sharp, imperious, with an undercurrent of disdain. "If you'd been paying proper attention, she wouldn't have bolted in the first place." The nanny's reply came lower, smoother. "Children run. That's what they do. I caught her before she fell. She's safe. That's what matters." "You will not speak to me about what matters," the older woman snapped. "What matters is that Lily learns boundaries. She cannot grow up with the impression that people like you are anything more than temporary help." The words stung even from a distance. Thomas's jaw tightened. There was a pause. Then the nanny's voice again, steady, almost measured. "Children often grow up learning more than their guardians intend. They watch. They listen. They remember." Thomas leaned forward, straining to catch every syllable. Her tone wasn't defensive. It wasn't even particularly deferential. It was something sharper, cloaked in silk, the voice of someone who knew the weight of truth but wasn't ready to reveal it. "Don't you dare lecture me," the grandmother hissed. "You're here because I allow it. Remember your place." "My place," the nanny repeated softly, almost as though she were testing the phrase. "Yes, Mrs. Ashworth, I'll remember." Yet there was something in the cadence of her words, an undercurrent of irony, a blade hidden in velvet. It wasn't submission. It was a note carefully placed for anyone truly listening. A gate clanged shut and footsteps receded into the estate. Silence reclaimed the street. Thomas sat motionless, staring at the ironwork of the Ashworth gate, the nanny's words echoing in his mind. Children remember. He rubbed a hand over his face, the weight of decision pressing on him. For years he had built walls around himself, insulating his grief with work, money, and distance from anything that threatened to stir his heart. But tonight, sitting in the shadows with his daughter asleep behind him, he felt those walls tremble. Emma stirred, murmuring in her sleep. "She's not afraid," she whispered, as if the dream and the waking world had blurred into one. Thomas froze. He looked once more at the grand house and the glowing windows beyond the gate. The woman inside was no ordinary nanny. Of that, he was certain. And whatever she was planning, Thomas Harrison had just stepped into its orbit. The morning sun cut through the glass walls of Harrison Innovations like a blade, glinting off polished steel and black marble. The building's lobby was designed to intimidate. Towering ceilings, minimalist furniture, and the low hum of wealth in every surface. Thomas had always preferred it that way. His fortress, his shield, a place where emotion could not seep in. But today, as he strode across the atrium with a file tucked under his arm, he felt uneasy. The nanny's face had haunted him for days. Those steady eyes, that unreadable smile, the way she'd stood against humiliation without breaking. And Emma, ever perceptive, had only added to the weight. She's not afraid, she's waiting. The words gnawed at him. He stepped into the boardroom, expecting the usual suspects, investors with crisp suits, lawyers with sharpened pens. Instead, his breath caught. At the far end of the table sat the very woman who had unsettled him at the zoo. No uniform, no bowed head. Her posture was straight, her tailored blazer the shade of deep navy, her hair swept neatly back. She was not holding a child's hand now, but a stack of folders embossed with the seal of Harvard University. The air around her was electric. The chairman cleared his throat. "Mr. Harrison, allow me to introduce Dr. Jasmine Carter. She's here to present findings relevant to our ongoing discussions regarding educational partnerships." Thomas masked his reaction with practiced control, sliding into his chair, but inside, every nerve hummed. Jasmine met his eyes briefly, and in that look was no flicker of recognition from the zoo, not overtly. Yet beneath the surface, Thomas sensed she remembered. Her calm that day had not been coincidence, it had been deliberate. She opened a folder, her voice smooth, authoritative. "For the last 6 months, I've been conducting an embedded investigation into discriminatory practice. Within several elite private schools, including the Ashworth Academies." She slid documents across the table. Emails, contracts, policies, all of which demonstrate systemic exclusion of both racial minorities and children with disabilities. The room stiffened. Pages were shuffled. Eyebrows rose. Thomas skimmed the papers, his stomach tightening. There it was in black and white. Unfit applicants. Preserve exclusivity. Avoid disabled enrollments. Phrases cold as ice, written by hands that saw children as liabilities. "Many of you," Jasmine continued, "may recognize the Ashworth name. Their reputation is one of tradition. Their reality is one of exclusion and prejudice, protected by wealth and influence. Until now." The words landed with the weight of an indictment, and though her eyes swept the room, they lingered on Thomas just a fraction longer than necessary. A question burned in him. Why reveal herself here, in his domain? Why him? An investor at the table spoke up. "And what do you propose, Dr. Carter?" Jasmine folded her hands neatly. "Partnership, funding for inclusive education initiatives, exposure of Ashworth practices through both legal and media channels, and most importantly, protection for the children already harmed." Thomas should have remained detached the way he always had, but he thought of Emma, blind, excluded, yet unbroken. He thought of her words at the zoo. She's carrying a secret in her pocket. Now that secret lay open before him. And though Jasmine Carter spoke with the poise of a professional, Thomas saw the other truth in her eyes. She was at war, a war she intended to win. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of something he thought had died with his wife, not just anger, but purpose. The widow and the undercover scholar, their paths had collided, not by accident, but by design. And somewhere behind the lock, Ked gates of her estate, Victoria Ashworth had no idea that her empire was about to be shaken at its foundation. The storm gathered quietly, in conference rooms and shadowed corners of the city, where deals were struck not with signatures, but with whispered intent. Thomas found himself once again seated across from Jasmine Carter, though this time the sterile boardroom had been traded for the warm wood and muted lamplight of a private law office. Heavy drapes muffled the city noise, and the faint smell of leather and old books clung to the air. Across from them sat Dr. Marcus Williams, civil rights attorney, his presence commanding without theatrics. The files sprawled across the table told a story darker than Thomas had dared imagine. Emails laced with contempt, recordings of board meetings where children with disabilities were dismissed as burdens, enrollment logs that conspicuously thinned whenever a minority family applied, a machine built not for education but for exclusion. Jasmine's voice remained calm as she laid out the evidence, though Thomas saw the fire in her eyes. I embedded with the Ashworths for months. Every insult, every dismissal, every offhand remark, I documented it, not just for Lily, though she deserves better, but for every child they've denied. Dr. Williams nodded, tapping the stack of contracts with one broad finger. This is enough to bring them to their knees, but we can't go at this with noise alone. We need strategy. If we move too soon, they'll bury it in litigation and spin the narrative in the press. We need timing. Thomas leaned forward, his jaw tight. And protection. They won't take this lying down. He hadn't meant to sound so personal, but Emma's face flashed in his mind, her small hand in his, her voice whispering, Daddy, will the mean lady stop hurting people now? He had promised her, and promises were currency he refused to squander. Jasmine studied him quietly. There was no pity in her gaze, only understanding. You know what's at stake, she said softly. He met her eyes. I do, and I've spent years sitting on the sidelines. Not anymore. For the first time since his wife's death, Thomas felt the armor he'd built around himself shift, not cracking but reshaping. His grief had turned him into a man who observed rather than acted, who retreated rather than confronted. Yet sitting here, the father in him roared louder than the widower's silence. Dr. Williams slid a document across the table. Federal investigators are ready to move when we give the word. The press will need a face, a witness, someone credible. Jasmine, you've already put yourself on the line. But a case like this, it'll take more. The room went still. Thomas understood before the words were spoken. His name, his influence, his company. It was weight they needed. He'd built an empire by mastering silence, but now silence would make him complicit. Emma's words echoed again, insistent as a drumbeat. Stop the mean lady. Thomas signed the page with deliberate strokes, his name bleeding into the ink. Then let's make sure she can never hurt another child again. For the first time that night, Jasmine allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't triumph. It was something fiercer. Resolve. Outside, the city lights blinked like watchful eyes. Somewhere behind guarded gates, Victoria Ashworth still believed herself untouchable. She had no idea the noose was already tightening. The boardroom at Ashworth Academy gleamed with the polish of old money. Mahogany walls, portraits of stone-faced benefactors, and chandeliers that dripped with light like frozen rain. The seats around the long oak table were filled with men and women who believed themselves the custodians of legacy, their posture rigid, their voices low as they shuffled through quarterly reports and enrollment forecasts. Victoria Ashworth presided at the head, pearls catching the glow like a queen's crown. Her smile was thin, her tone sharp as she reminded the board of their duty to maintain standards. Then the doors burst open. 2 federal investigators strode inside, flanked by uniformed officers. A ripple of alarm swept through the room, chairs scraping against polished floors. Cameras followed, carried by reporters who'd clearly been tipped off. Victoria's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly, rising to her feet. This is outrageous. You cannot barge into a private board meeting. The lead investigator held up a warrant. We can, and we will. And then Jasmine stepped through the doorway. No uniform this time, no bowed head. She wore a sleek black suit, her posture straight, her expression unyielding. Every eye turned to her, confusion rippling across the faces of the board members who had only ever seen her as the help. Dr. Jasmine Carter, the investigator announced as though unveiling a weapon. Your testimony and documentation have been central to this case. Gasps, murmurs. One board member dropped his pen. Victoria's face blanched, then flushed crimson. You, her voice cracked with disbelief. You've been in my home, with my granddaughter. How dare you? Protect her? Jasmine's voice cut like glass, calm, unflinching. How dare I record the truth you thought no one else would ever hear? Every slur, every exclusion, every policy designed to keep children, like Emma Harrison, out. The name hit Thomas like a physical force. From the shadows near the press, he stepped forward, Emma's small hand wrapped in his. Gasps turned toward him now. the widowed millionaire, his face familiar from magazines and business journals. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "My daughter is blind," he said evenly, "and yet she sees more clearly than any of you." His gaze lingered on Victoria. "She heard your cruelty at the zoo that day. She felt the weight of it, and she asked me to stop you. So I will." Cameras clicked like gunfire. Reporters leaned forward, hungry. The investigator pressed play on a recorder. Victoria's own voice filled the chamber, dripping with venom. "We can't admit these children. They don't belong in our halls. They're distractions, burdens. We must preserve the quality of our name." The words echoed, magnified by the silence that followed. Every face turned toward Victoria, now pale and trembling. "No," she stammered, clutching the table edge. "This is taken out of context. This is manipulation." But the evidence was overwhelming. Contracts, emails, recordings, a house of cards collapsing under its own arrogance. Board members shifted uneasily. Some avoided her gaze entirely. Others whispered to reporters. Victoria's empire crumbled in real time. The woman who had wielded power like a weapon now found herself exposed, stripped bare before the very society she had sought to control. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't even smile. She simply stood, unshaken, her gaze fixed on the woman whose downfall she had orchestrated. And Thomas, with Emma's hand still warm in his, felt something he hadn't in years, vindication not just for himself, but for every child silenced, dismissed, cast aside. But even as the investigators escorted Victoria away, her eyes locked onto his. For the briefest moment there was, as no fear in them, only fury, coiled, dangerous, unfinished. Thomas's stomach tightened. The battle was won. But the war, he realized, had only just begun. The courtroom smelled faintly of polish and paper, its vaulted ceiling echoing with the low murmur of gathered reporters. For months, Chicago had waited for this day, the sentencing of Victoria Ashworth. Outside, protesters held signs demanding justice. Parents who'd once been silenced, now emboldened by the storm Jasmine Carter had set in motion. Thomas sat near the back, Emma's small hand curled around his. She leaned against his arm, her sightless eyes turning instinctively toward the sounds around her, shuffling papers, whispered conversations, the scrape of heels against marble. "Daddy," she whispered, "is the mean lady here?" "Yes," Thomas replied softly, his gaze fixed on the woman across the aisle. Victoria Ashworth no longer looked like the imperious queen of Chicago society. The pearls were gone, replaced by a plain navy suit. Her posture had withered. Her face carried the pallor of sleepless nights. Yet her eyes burned with something dangerous, even now. The judge entered, and silence fell. What followed was a litany of sins recited aloud: systematic discrimination, fraudulent admissions practices, civil rights violations. Each charge struck like a drumbeat, a dismantling of the empire Victoria had built brick by brick on the backs of those she had excluded. When it was her turn to speak, Victoria rose. For a moment her voice trembled, then it hardened. "You think you've won?" she spat, glaring at Jasmine across the room. "But you don't understand the world you're meddling with. My family's influence does not end here. You've only destroyed one institution. There are others. There are always others." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge silenced her sharply, but the damage was done. Her words carried the echo of a threat, a reminder that prejudice is not confined to one woman, one family, one name. When the gavel struck, the sentence fell, 5 years in prison. The crowd erupted, some in relief, some in outrage. Cameras flashed. Victoria was led away, her wrists bound in steel. Yet as she passed Thomas, she turned her head ever so slightly, her eyes locking with his. A smile, small, cold, defiant, ghosted across her lips before she disappeared through the door. Emma squeezed her father's hand. "She's still angry," she whispered. "Yes," Thomas said, his throat tight, "but she can't hurt anyone anymore." Emma tilted her head, as if listening to something deeper than words. "No, Daddy, not her. Others, like her. I can feel it." Her words lingered long after they left the courthouse. Months passed and the world shifted. Ashworth schools crumbled, their assets seized. In their place rose something new, a network of inclusive academies founded by Thomas and Jasmine, where children of every background and ability learned side by side. Emma became their brightest symbol, her laughter echoing in halls that had once closed their doors to her. At the ribbon cutting of the newest school, reporters crowded around Jasmine. She stood tall, her voice steady as she said, "The best revenge isn't punishment, it's progress." This is what Victoria Ashworth could never understand. That the future cannot be gated, it grows, whether the powerful like it or not. Applause thundered. Yet that night, as Thomas watched Emma play in the garden, his phone buzzed with an encrypted message. No sender, just 3 words glowing on the screen. "This isn't over." His hand tightened around the device, a chill sliding down his spine. In the house behind him, Jasmine worked late, finalizing curriculum for the new schools. Emma's laughter rang in the air, pure and unbothered. Thomas slipped the phone into his pocket, a storm brewing in his chest. The battle against Victoria was over, but the war, the deeper war against the shadows that still lived in boardrooms, in traditions, in whispers of old money, had only just begun. And this time, he knew, the fight would be bigger than any of them had imagined.